A virtual component in SOLIDWORKS is a component that's saved internally, or in other words, directly within the assembly file. This means that no external part files or external references are required by the assembly, making it virtual within the assembly. There are a few ways to create virtual components. If you use top-down assembly design, you'll find that when you insert a new component into an assembly, you're essentially starting a component from scratch within the assembly environment. This component will, by default, start as a virtual component. SOLIDWORKS gives you the option to save it as an external file, but a new component will always start virtually within the assembly file. Another method of making a component virtual is when inserting existing components into an assembly. This lets you still use a bottom-up assembly design approach, where you design components as their own part files, but when you insert the part into the assembly does not reference the external part file. Let me show you what I mean. I'll go to Insert, Components, and browse for a part to insert into this assembly. Before clicking the green check, notice at the bottom the Make Virtual checkbox is available. If I check it and insert a component into this assembly, I get a message saying that making a component virtual breaks the link to the external file. This means any changes I make to the virtual component in this assembly will not reflect on the original part file, or vice versa. If I make changes to the part file, the link would be broken to this virtual component. I'll click OK, and the virtual component is added. Notice the name of the part, copy of the part name, followed by the assembly name. It is possible to rename the part, but I can't change the assembly name after it. This lets you know which assembly it's contained in virtually. I'll enter a new name and press Enter. The component now has the new name followed by the assembly name. The last method I'll go over here to create a virtual component is to right-click on an existing component and click Make Virtual. Here I have a component where the assembly is referencing its external part file, but I'd like to make it a virtual component instead. This can be useful in cases where you have a few instances of the same component and need to make a change to one particular instance, or if you simply want to make the folder structure and file relationships easier to manage. When I select it, I get the same message about breaking the link to the virtual file. I'll click OK, and the virtual component is shown in the feature tree. To see the effect of the file relationships for all of the virtual components, I can go to File, Find References, and you can see that while most of the parts of this assembly have their own part files, the virtual components are saved within the assembly file and do not reference their own separate part files. One last thing here. Although virtual components do not have external part files, you can still share them with other assemblies by copying an existing virtual component from one assembly to another. To do this, I'll start a new assembly. Next, I'll tile my windows and drag and drop a virtual component from one assembly to another. Now keep in mind that when you do this, the copied virtual component is not linked to the original one. It becomes a virtual component of the new assembly without any external references. SOLIDWORKS will remind you of this with an alert message. I'll click OK, and the virtual component is copied into the new assembly. To finish this lesson, I mentioned that if you decide you don't want to save the component virtually and instead would like an external part file, you can right-click on the virtual component in the Feature Manager tree and select Save Part or Assembly as External File. This brings up a Save As dialog box. Instead of specifying a path, I'd like to save this external part in the same location as the assembly. And when I click OK, the external part file is created.